Very flattering introduction, and it's been great to be here. It's a great opportunity. Thank you for that. So, one thing I want to show here today is how useful these medieval chronicles, not just in Ireland really, but all over, well, I won't really show that, but by inference, they're very similar all across Europe and in Asia, can be for revealing human societal responses to extreme weather. Another thing I like to try and demonstrate is how useful independent environmental evidence from natural archives like ice cores and tree rings can be when brought in together with these sources. So, this is what we're looking at today, the Irish Annals. These are yearly listings of important events maintained originally in monastic communities across Ireland, running reliably from around 500 to 1600 AD. They contain reports of the establishment of religious settlements, obituaries of important persons, conflicts, extreme weather, natural hazards, and major societal stresses. Today, they survive in about 1 million words in 22 texts. Here is Clonmacnoise Monastery in the Irish Midlands on the River Shannon, where several major sets of annals were recorded for about 500 years. One of which is the Annals of Tiernach, and this is a page from these annals, this 14th century Middle Irish manuscript. I've highlighted a couple of items of interest. So this giant K here stands for the calends of January, or the 1st of January, and this denotes the start of the yearly list of entries of events. Below here, I've underlined some particular entries in the Irish. This one in yellow is perhaps the most relevant to us today, which reads in translation, "A great frost so that for the space of a month one went on foot on the lakes of Ireland." So quite unusual for Irish climate. So these sources contain numerous reports of extreme weather like storms, floods, frosts, and related impacts and societal stresses like harvest failures, famine, and so forth. Some examples, one from an Ulster source for 856 AD, there was much ice and frost so that the principal lakes and rivers of Ireland could be crossed by people on foot and on horseback from the 9th of December to the 7th of January, so very severe, one of the reasons why it gets noted. From a Southern Irish source in 1297, we've got very stormy weather, wind, snow, lightning, and great mortality of cattle and loss of life also. Even rarer in an Irish context, for 1252, from Connacht to West Ireland, we've great heat and drought in the summer. So that people used to cross the River Shannon without wetting their feet, maybe a slight exaggeration. And the wheat was reaped early, 20 nights before Lammas, which is the 1st of August, and the trees were burning from the sun, and the trees do confirm that this year was very unusual. So we can go through this 1.1 million words and pull out the references to extreme weather events and try and categorize them under some sensible headings, and this is what we get. We get reports of snow coming out on top here, not because they're the most common weather phenomena in Ireland, but because they're one of the most unusual for our mild maritime climate. So because of their unusual nature, they get picked up quite a lot. We've got these are windstorms, they're fairly common, but they're very destructive, so it's understandable why they're reported, thunder and lightning, and so forth. And when we look closer at the distribution, the values under each heading, we see basically what we would expect, given what we know of the modern Irish climate. Wet seasons and flooding come out pretty frequently, much more so than drought and other indications of dry weather with dry rivers. But this distribution really also mirrors what the scribes were mostly interested in. So if we look at this 1200-year period of coverage, there are 6 reports of there being good weather in that entire time, which is probably, even for Ireland, is probably an underestimate. So this is one of my fanciest looking graphs. I've been accused of making it deliberately look like a game of Tetris. Does anyone remember? Yeah, but what's really going on, I just realised today, is that I've subliminally used the Irish colours of the Irish flag everywhere. in it. Green, that was totally unconscious. So, this basically shows the occurrence of these extreme events that we've just seen in the last graph, but now arrayed through time, from 431, where the texts sort of start, down to 1649 at the end here. The top half of each panel shows the occurrence of these various extreme weather events, and the bottom half shows various major societal stresses. We'll run through them just very quickly. We've got severe windstorms, very severe low temperatures, high precipitation, so flooding and so forth, low precipitation, drought. Then we go on to things like famine and scarcity years. We have various, this is the agricultural disturbance index, which is my fancy way of saying various complaints about agricultural difficulties in the year. Harvest impacts, poor harvests, all animal mortality. So these are generally reports of animals dying en masse for various reasons. And human mortality, humans dying en masse for various reasons. So one of the useful things we can do with this information is to see if there are any systematic associations between each type of extreme weather and each type of societal stress. We can't just assume really that there is a systematic association between any given type of extreme weather and any given type of stress. For example, famines can often occur completely independently of weather conditions, and we see in the text frequently that scorched air policies are adopted in military conflicts, where basically a warring clan will go and destroy its rival's corn, take away its animals, and that will induce a famine. So we can't just assume that there is a systematic link here. If we look, we've got other examples here of extreme events with no apparent societal stresses occurring anywhere near them in time, and vice versa. We've got societal stresses with no real association, according to the text, with any extreme weather event. So how do we approach this issue? So we'll take the example of the 70 extreme cold years that are identified in the text across this period. One of the things we can do then simply is to count up the number of these 70 extreme cold years that also experienced, for example, poor harvests, if we look here at the top panel. So we can do that. But how then will we know basically whether this number that we count up, the number of these cold years that also experience poor harvests, is particularly high or unusually high, more than you might see if you just picked out 70 years in the text and randomly and counted up the number of poor harvests. For comparison then, you can also, one way of approaching it is you can, for comparison, count up the number of poor harvests that you see in the first year following all 70 cold events, the second year, the third year, and so on out to the 10th year, and even the preceding years, just to give you perspective on how many poor harvests you would likely to see if you just randomly picked out years, in comparison to these 70 years, which are represented by 0 here on the graph, these 7 years of severe cold. And so it turns out here basically, when we count up the number of poor harvests in these 70 years, we see that 10% of them also experience poor harvest. And often the texts don't make any link at all between these events. And the events may be even reported in completely independent texts. So 10%, it's the slightly elevated number above what happens in preceding years and following years. So it's not a massive increase here, but we can do a little statistical test to see how random this elevated number of poor harvests is likely to be in these 70 years. Basically, the test mimics a person going and randomly picking out 70 years over and over and over again and counting up the number of those that have poor harvests, and then compares it to what you see in the actual 70 years, and the chance of seeing 10% of those years also having poor harvests is less than 2.5%. So we can do this sort of thing. Now if we look down, so that's that. if we look at reporting of mass animal mortalities in these 70 cold years, now we see that there's very strong association between them statistically. Just under 35% of these severe cold years also have reports of mass animal mortality, whereas the preceding and following years is much lower. So there's certainly something going on here according to the numbers. We can look at other types of stresses, famine and scarcity. See it elevated again, above 10%, around 11% of years the severe cold had reported conditions of famine and scarcity, and of mass human mortality, basically 20% of the cold years had this reported societal stress. Again, much more than you would see just randomly in the preceding and following years. So, we can then do this exercise for all sorts of extreme weather event types. Here we have the cold weather. Just now all the different stresses stacked up on one column to the left. And now we've got wet weather for comparison to the right. Okay. So wet weather, extreme wet weather. There were 42 years identified as extremely wet across this entire period. And we see that over 35% of these also had reports of poor harvests. So that's a very strong link, much more strong than cold weather. But when we look at the other stresses like mass animal mortality, nothing clearly going on here. Same for conditions of famine and scarcity, and same for conditions of mass human mortality. So, by comparing these extremes in this way, we can start to have an idea of the dynamics that are going on in society, linking different types of extreme events to different types of stress. And here we probably have a classic example of an extreme event, cold weather, which can impact both branches of the agricultural economy, arable agriculture and pastoral and the dairying economy, which leads to conditions of famine and leads to conditions of mortality. Whereas wet weather only impacts apparently the poor harvests, and so people can get by on dairying and on cattle, and it doesn't result in mass human mortality or famine. Apologies for the noise. Okay, so we've looked now at extreme weather versus various types of societal stresses. We can also look at what these sources richly record, which are various types of violence and conflict, such as depicted here in this 16th century woodcut from Ireland, or an Englishman's view of Ireland, actually, but it's pretty accurate. It is. So we've got here Exhibit A. It's very sophisticated. Exhibit A. These are gallows glasses, bands of Scottish mercenaries essentially coming in all over Ireland, getting paid to do various unsightly deeds. We have, and these sort of events are all reported in the text systematically. A raid on a house and the burning of the house. This is reported very systematically as well. A favourite of the Irish nobility. Basically, young Irish nobility were basically expected to do this to prove themselves. The cattle raid. So people are getting their cattle stolen as well. But this horse does look, actually, I just know he's quite happy about it. Even though these things are, he does. There is very terrible things, but he's having a good time, at least. Okay. We're going to focus now on basically one type of violent event that's reported systematically in the sources. These are violent individual killings, or killings of individuals. Here's an example. Donegal O'Carlin was killed by the Kenalone, which is a major clan, through the miracle of St. Columkill in 1180 CE. So basically, these texts have been written in monasteries from an ecclesiastical perspective. if you look back through the text, Donica is actually a bad boy. He gets up to all sorts of raiding of monasteries. So when he finally does get killed, the scribe feels, that he can attribute this great event to one of the patron saints of Ireland, Columkill, coming in and basically delivering divine retribution in a way. From 1213 CE, we have Ruairi O'Concobar was killed by Dervigel, daughter of O'Concobar. And the deed was done for a fee by a band of gallows glasses, these guys. So basically we've got mercenaries and assassinations and things. Also organised by women, which is great, equal opportunities in a way. So we've got Glun Erne, king of the foreigners, for which you can read Norsemen, Vikings, and he was killed when drunk by his own slave in 989 CE. Do we have any Norsemen actually here for you today? No? Okay. Well, they're not the only ones who can get drunk, as you imagine. So we've got Doncha, Arch-King of Argyll, the Irish king, was mangled with the battle axe of his own servant whilst the king was drunk, and he died thereof in 1168. Then we've got more sort of ambiguous reports. The learned Bishop Flann, Abbot of Inniskeen, was killed by poison in 784. That's all we know. He was just killed by poison. We don't know why. Even more obscure, secret murder was committed in Kildare, in the monastery, in 885 CE, and that's all we know about it basically. So it has remained secret for quite a few centuries. So, if we go through one of the major annalistic texts, the Annals of Ulster, and we were to count out the number of these individual killings through time, from 650 to 1400 here, this is what we would see. There are long periods of relatively constant killings on average, and the average is represented by this pale blue line. And the individual values of killings for each year are the red. This is the red line. So we do see also some notable increases in the average, like around here, from 1000 to 1100, which is probably to be associated with the decline of the Viking or Norse power after their defeat in the 1014 Battle of Clontarf, and then the ensuing base aftermath in the power vacuum where the Irish proceed then to kill each other instead of the Vikings. Okay, so you get this blip for a century. We also see then many individual years of anomalously elevated killings above the average, so these big large spikes. Large departures of the red line above the blue line, effectively. So I'm interested right now in any environmental contribution to these anomalous years. One way I like to try and examine the environmental contribution is by reference to independent environmental evidence from ice cores and from tree rings. And here is a famous Irish oak in County Offaly, that's me standing on it. And basically the locals think this is the king oak. They think it's 1,000 years old. It is very old, but it's probably only less than half of that. But we don't want to actually upset them too much. But they don't let you see it, basically. It's on the ground, it's locked off. So, and here's where it survived a lightning strike actually in 1960, so it's doing reasonably well. Here is an example of a sample of an ancient Irish oak that was dug up from the margin of a bog, where it luckily got preserved there in the acidic conditions in the water for millennia, basically, well, 1.5 millennia, I should say. If we look at a close-up, you can see the annual growth rings, where each year the tree puts on a new ring. That's how it grows taller and wider. And the size of this ring is largely controlled by what the growing season climate was like. Basically spring and early summer. So you can see the tree is doing really well right up here. It's doing really well in 532, which is labelled. And shortly after that, it starts to do less well. Until finally you get to these period of rings in the 540s where basically you can't actually see the individual rings anymore. If we look at a lot of the trees growing in Ireland at the time, At this time, this is what we see in terms of the annual ring size. Doing really well, and then bam, into 540. And we have 5 or 6 years of very poor growth. And this is basically a famous period of global climatic downturn, where we have volcanic dust veils probably seen in various parts of the world, in China and in the Middle East. In 536, 537, we read that the sun became dark, and the darkness lasted for 1.5 years. The light was only a feeble shadow, the fruits did not ripen, and so forth, from a Middle Eastern source at the time. In Ireland, even though recording is very rudimentary at this time, the event is obviously significant enough that we do see it register simply in 3 words, failure of bread. Actually, it's only 2 words in Latin, so that's it for 538. But even at this time, the event is significant enough to register. Okay. So if we look at the tree ring growth across a longer period, here we have 650 to 1020 CE. You can see some great years where it was probably quite wet and the trees love that. But also you get tree ring minima, as they're known, where it was either very, very dry or very cold. Statistically, we can pick out which years are quite rare. They're basically below this blue line, and the red line is the long-term average. So anything below this blue line is basically a year where the trees are saying this is quite bad. We can then overlay, for this period, the 61 years where the number of killings is quite high, anomalously high, we could say, quite beyond the average number of killings for the preceding years and the following years. We can see some obvious correspondences here, encircled in red, but yet again there are plenty of examples where there is no clear correspondence, as highlighted in grey there. So once again, we can use the method that we've used previously, those fancy looking graphs, to see just exactly how much correspondence there is and how likely it is to be random. Okay, so this shows the average reported incidence of killings between these 2 bracketing extreme tree ring minima, years of very poor growth in 662 to 1377. And we see that the average number of killings actually does peak just in the year before the trees say it was very bad. And this is when, as an advocate of using these natural proxies with texts, I would say that you also need to know exactly how the trees behave, because they're not actually thermometers. They're a complex biological system, and it's reasonably well known that if you hit a tree hard in year 1, for example, with some sort of extreme weather, it might not show up in the tree until the 2nd year or even the 3rd year after the extreme, because the tree has a lot of carbohydrate reserves and so forth, and so it can sustain itself in the year of the event. So this little delay here is not actually too surprising. We can do another randomness test, see how likely, if you were to pick out, so there were 115 of these tree ring minima in this time. So if you went to the time series we have of the number of killings and picked out randomly 115 years, how likely would you be to see such an elevated value, number of killings, just purely by picking out years at random? You have less than 5% chance. Actually, you'd only have a 3.1% chance of just randomly picking out a year with so many killings, so many years with so many killings. We can have a look also at the long-term average reported killing rate per year across this entire period, and it's 1.9. So we can see basically that this is well above the average, so it's probably not just random, probably something was going on here. Interestingly, the years following it also sort of elevated, but not elevated enough so that I could stand here and say this is not random. But it is interesting as well that in the years after this very extreme weather event, that there's continues to be an elevated level of killings with a sort of decline and much less elevated before the extreme event, obviously. Okay, so some conclusions. Hopefully I have convinced very briefly that there's a lot of potential in these medieval chronicles, which are often quite disparaged sources for being so terse and for not taking on a narrative form explaining why one event links into another event, but that there's potential in them to illuminate aspects of human relationships with the environment, and that this can be augmented usefully by natural archives like tree ring records. When I give a presentation and I suggest any systematic links either in the present or in the past between extremes, extreme events and violence, this is quite controversial, and it is in the literature as well. But actually, as environmental archives become more available and are combined with historical records in this way, the existence, if not the actual workings, how the actual link works, is becoming apparent. The existence of this link, at least, is becoming apparent. The literature, the situation in terms of the controversies and held by many of the people who have studied this sort of issue are climate scientists, and basically are very deterministic when they present their results. They're basically bad weather equals violence, you know. So that doesn't generally go down well with an audience that knows anything about society from multiple other disciplines. So we do need to understand complex societal dynamics underlying these sort of links, where, for example, technology, it could be military, it could be agriculture, it could be population levels and mix, it could be political and economic systems at the time, belief systems and so forth, will mediate impacts of extremes on society, which is something I try and impress when I'm presenting this to a very sciencey sort of audience. And we also must expect that societal responses to extremes are going to evolve through time in tandem with the above societal characteristics, these sort of variables. So I'm just going to show one more thing. Last slide, I promise. This is, you've basically seen those graphs. They're very spiky, and that is the response of society, various stresses to a given extreme event across this whole period, sort of squashed into, averaged out, squashed into one. But you can expect that maybe in a given century the link between famines and cold weather might not be so strong. Maybe there's a new agricultural type adopted, more sophisticated technology and so forth. And so if you look at how this association between, this is for cold weather and mass animal mortality here, varies across time. You see some quite interesting changes where, for example, there's a big jump up when cold weather occurs from around 1000 AD onwards. It's now much more often associated in terms of percentages with mass animal mortality than it was previously. We see when we look at extreme cold weather and the reporting of famine and scarcity, though, we see this long-term decline in the reporting of famine and scarcity in the years of these cold events, and then followed by an increase, a long-term increase. And then we look at mass human mortality. It's doing all sorts of things. So basically things are changing through time, there's no doubt about it, and this must be linked to what's going on in terms of society at the time. But it's probably pretty complex. I don't know yet. May never fully know. I might not admit that always though. But yeah, and also it's complex because climate is also changing in the background as well. Maybe the extreme events in this period, the extreme cold events, are just not as extreme as they were in the earlier and later periods. So this is basically where I am at now, and I think I'll give you a break. Thank you very much.